Welcome to the Federal's Worldly Wise program, a weekly show where our consulting editor K.S. Dakshina Murthy unboxes the latest in international developments. This week's topic is a no brainer. US President Donald Trump has imposed his long feared tariffs on India. While economists and corporates debate over Trump's decision to impose 25% tariffs plus penalties on India, we discuss how this plays out politically and diplomatically. So, thank you for joining. And my first question to you is, what is India to make of Trump's economic missile from a political perspective?
Uh, to begin with, this is a wake-up call for India. Um, Number one, it's a wake-up call because it clearly shows that India needs to be independent in more ways than one. All this while, there was a feeling that between India and the US and their close relationship, somewhere India would kind of get away with, lightly by Trump. But it really hasn't worked out like that. What it basically shows is that international politics, works on on real politics. There is nothing. There is no space for charity or for friendship or for any other reason other than national interest. And Trump is acting or is doing this, his latest decisions, especially with regard to the tariff. He calls it in his national interest, that is in the national interest of the US. It really doesn't matter to Trump whether friendly countries are affected. So India is at the receiving end, and and this is happening. Trump's announcement has come at a time when negotiations are on between India and the US to kind of work out a fair trade deal. So, but then Trump, as usual, has jumped the gun and he has made this announcement. Now, what it basically does for India politically is that it really needs to recalibrate how it views its country, its relationship with the US, and it's also the relationship with China and Russia, and where India itself stands as far as its broader foreign policy is concerned. Now, as far as the US is concerned, for a long time, India has been, there has been a kind of a kid glove treatment that India has received from the US in return for, favors that the US expects India to do. And India, especially under Prime Minister Modi, appear to have gone out of its way to kind of appease the US, appease Trump. So even after January 20th, when Trump made the initial announcement that he is going to impose reciprocal tariffs, India really did not, there was no kind of pushback from India. There was, like, for instance, what I mean is, let's say China, for instance, said that it would have retaliatory tariffs when Trump imposed his tariff. And even, but India did nothing of that kind. It looked as if India was kind of going along with Trump. And in fact, this also attracted some criticism for Prime Minister Modi. And, there was a feeling that India had given in too easily. So now is the time when the reality kicks in and India is as good or as bad as any other country. And the other important thing that we need to realize is there is nothing like a friendly country kind of an arrangement. It's basically a national interest. So when the US says that India is friends with the US, what it basically means is that it regards India as a country that can be used for the perspectives for the national security interests of the US. For example, India is seen as a kind of a bulwark against China. And given the, if at all there is a crisis in future, or even now when India needs to, when the US needs to act against China, India is used to put pressure on China, for instance, in the South China Seas and in the Pacific. So the Quad, for instance, is it's a prime example of how the US looks at other countries where India is part of the Quad It's not because India is very close to the US and there is some kind of a bonhomie. There is, of course, probably a diplomatic bonhomie, but the reality, the real reason is that the Quad is seen as a kind of a pushback against China, and that is where India comes in. So, but then India can't look at itself from a US perspective and then sit back and say, fine, we are required for the US to handle China. So that cannot, that kind of a line which India has generally taken. So there is an element of complacency that has crept in as far as India is concerned, in the way it has evolved its foreign policy. So Trump's decision, in some ways, is a kind of a shock treatment, I would say, for India, and India really needs to rethink its priorities.
Shock treatment it is. My next question is, how is it that despite India's friendly relations with the US, particularly the bonami between Trump and Modi, so New Delhi has not been given any leeway? How do we see that?
Yes, that is the nature of. See, this is not. I wouldn't call it a fault of India, because if you look at the US, it reacts and responds to situations around the world purely from its own national interest. In the past, for instance, if you take, say, Pakistan was, it worked very closely with the US when during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But eventually, when the 9/11 attacks happened in 2001, the US suddenly turned against Pakistan, and in fact, it turned really it imposed penalties on Pakistan. It withdrew military aid, and it put a lot of pressure on the Pervez Musharraf government to to work against the Taliban and to be with the US, which Pakistan found it very difficult at the time, because until that point, the Taliban, Pakistan, the US, and Saudi Arabia were on the same page. So when everything changed in 9/11, it's not that the US treated Pakistan as a friend and gave it that kind of a gap. Nothing of the sort happened. The US turned against Pakistan in some ways. In fact, that was also the period when it got closer to India. In fact, the so-called dehyphenation in some ways happened during that period, because the US did a lot of favors for India, and it really took on Pakistan. Now, what this means is that it's not that the US suddenly found a great love for India. It is the US was working against Pakistan, and India benefited from that. So, similarly, in the case of the Middle East, Saddam Hussein, who was at one time a close friend of the US, finally fell out with the US, and then we all know what happened. The US invaded Iraq, and then ousted him from power. So the point with the US is that it will sit with you. It will also kick you depending on where it stands. So as far as India is concerned, India and the US, as far as the people-to-people relations are concerned, has been very good always, even during the Cold War, when India was closer to the Soviet Union politically. As far as people were concerned, India and the US had shared a close relationship. So all this kind of gave an aura of India being a huge democratic country, being very friendly with the US, which is another, which is also a big democratic country and a big power at that. So all this kind of nice, fluffy optics uh, gave the impression that India was in some ways more special than other people. So, and the relationship between Modi and Trump exemplified that. But in reality, the US looks at all countries alike, and the tariff really shows that this is what it is. So, what the Indian government and the foreign policy makers, or the in South Bloc, should realize is that there is no getting away from the fact that India needs to assert itself politically, it needs to assert itself economically, and then act as an independent country in more ways than one. It's not just enough to be independent on paper, but then being dependent on any one country.
Will Trump's tariff actually affect India's relationship with Russia, given that India is being penalized for that?
Yes, so now that is the right now the pressing question. So now that the US has threatened penalties, in fact, he has spoken very disparagingly even today, Trump, on this relationship between Russia and India, and he has even said they can both go down the hill, or something to that effect. See, the point here is. It has put a lot of pressure on India, and India is not in a good space as far as its foreign policy is concerned, because it is it is hemmed in from all sides. It cannot, under any circumstances, afford to antagonize Russia, or to distance itself from Russia because the US is putting pressure on India. Because if it does that, it has its own implications, because Russia continues to be a very important trading partner, and it has a historic relationship with India. India still buys much of its arms from Russia, and during this period of the war with Ukraine, India has benefited a lot by importing crude from Russia. So all these things put together, it makes it very difficult for India to in any way distance itself from Russia. But if it does not distance itself from Russia, Trump is threatening penalties, and they, in going forward, they may, there may even be sanctions imposed on India, because Trump is also talking, and along with his the European Union, they're talking about secondary tariffs on countries that have a trading relationship with Russia. So India is absolutely an important ally. So of Russia. So in that sense, India is really now slowly it has moved into the firing line. It would have been very good for India if Trump had actually brokered a deal between Ukraine and Russia, because India would have escaped this situation. But now that this hasn't happened, India has now slowly got back into the firing line. It was in the firing line when the Biden administration was, in the last phase of the Biden administration. But then Trump came in, and the whole equation changed. It was a relief for India, but right now, the kind of pressure that India is in, it will require every bit of thinking and maneuvering and strategizing to deal with the US, and also not to ensure that there is no distancing from Russia.
So, what can India learn from all this? What is the lesson for India's foreign policy?
Number one, what India should, really adhere to its time-tested or time-held policy of multilateral relationship, which means that India should not depend on any one particular country for any reason. For example, India, as far as the Indian government is concerned, it feels that in some ways, if there is tension between India and China, it has the support of the US. Okay, now whether the US, how far the US will actually come in and support India, nobody knows, because that situation actually hasn't arisen. And even during all these border skirmishes and all that, the US really did not do anything. So, as far as, but then India psychologically feels that any kind of a tension with China, there is the US to depend on, which may not be a very good strategy, because like I said, it's not clear what the US will eventually do, because the US itself has a relationship with China. So the other thing is that, so which means that India should ensure that it has a good relationship with China. It needs to resolve the differences, whatever is there, including even the border dispute, and make all efforts to ensure that the neighborly relations with China are strengthened. And India should also farm out its trade, ensure that it looks at new markets, particularly in Africa and other countries in Latin America, where with whom India is, which actually could be very useful for India, because these are big markets, and not really depend on one country. That is one thing. The second thing is that India should internally become much more stronger, as far as its economy is concerned. It should ideally become more independent in many things, including in the defense sector, and also to ensure that it it is in a position to retaliate or to oppose certain decisions of the US. Like if you take China, for instance, why is today China regarded highly as far as, and almost considered to be on par with the US or Russia? The reason for that is it politically does not hesitate to stand against the US and make its point publicly when the situation arises. The Chinese don't bend down so easily to the US. Now, why is China able to do that? Because China has become a big economic power. It is very strong internally. It has a huge manufacturing base, and it's gone all over the world. In fact, it has spread its tentacles or its reach through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's got a big presence in Africa. So China today has really very quietly and very carefully and thoughtfully spread itself across the world. India too has some kind of a presence elsewhere, but it is not enough. And this basically does is that if India really takes re-looks at its foreign policy, makes it genuinely multilateral, I think it would benefit India a lot. And what Trump has done, in some ways, it's a huge challenge for India. But challenges can also be an opportunities for new ways of looking at politics and diplomacy. And this probably, I would even say, it's kind of a blessing in disguise for India. It can reset its foreign policy. It can look at various issues with a fresh perspective and ensure that it's independent and stands apart as far as the world is concerned.
Thank you for your time, sir.